like I said, I am almost 39 years old. One of the more interesting things, in my life is I consider myself blessed to be the age that I am, given the interests that I have. And one of those reasons is that out of all of the generations, Generation X, which I am very proudly right in the heart of, we got to see both sides of a very interesting coin. Now, granted, we're not really in that. Oh, back in my day, we didn't have none of this newfangled TV thing on the Flubies. If we wanted to watch people run around and talk about things that weren't real, we went to the Playhouse. None of that. But we spent our early childhood in the 70s and early 80s. And then our teenage years were spent in the late 80s to the 90s, or, the mid 90s. And then our adult years, or young adult years, were spent in the latter half of the 90s. What was interesting was that technology, particularly as applies to those things that we do for entertainment and for research, and a lot of things that get taken for granted in life these days, went through a very noticeable shift. There were a lot of those kind of changes all throughout the 1900s, but a really significant change happened over that period between the 70s and the 2000s. When I was a kid, we had cable TV as long as I can remember. I think ours was actually one of the first neighbors out where I lived that actually had cable. And the main reason being that there really wasn't much that you could pick up on antenna at that point. I think there was, if you had a really, really good antenna, you could pick up a couple of stations out of Salt Lake City, which was about at that time, about 3 hours away, to the west. And there were two stations. Again, if you had a really good antenna and the wind was just right, there were two stations, only one of which had any kind of reliability, that we could get out of Casper, Wyoming, which was about 4 hours in the other direction. And so we did have cable. The perk, when I was a very young kid, of having cable was that my parents actually spent the extra little bit of money. Let's see, back then I think it was probably $10 a month. I'd have to ask my dad. But it was quite a bit given at the time, because I think cable itself, I don't even know what the cable itself was, but all we had 13 channels. We had ABC, CBS, and NBC out of Salt Lake, and we had a PBS station. We had WTBS. We had sometimes WGN. That one kind of flip-flopped back and forth between a couple of different things. And then later, I want to say that I was maybe 6 at the time, 5 or 6. We eventually got CNN and ESPN. And then we had HBO, and that was literally it. That was all that was available. The other two channels were one was okay. The one channel that was left over was this was so goofy. We still have a channel like this. I am not even sure if it's on the same channel or if it's somewhere else, but it'll show It's just like have a local bulletin board. You know, it'll have a little computer thing. It'll throw ads and it'll show you stuff that's going on locally. Our equivalent back in that day was there was a camera set up on a tripod, and there was this row of different dials that were on a wall. And there was, so there was a clock, there was a thermometer, there was a wind direction, there was, basically all the same types of things that you would get on, say, like a weather channel or whatever, a little weather update. But literally, it was this camera on a little rotating tripod, and all it did was just pan back and forth over all of these dials. That was the whole channel. That was our channel 13. You get the time, you get enough to kind of get an idea what the weather was. That was the whole channel. That obviously, became something else later on down the line, but I do remember that. That was a pretty amazing thing. So anyway, so for TV, you saw, so it was in the 70s, that was TV. And then in the 80s, cable started, really having kind of an explosion, and for the first time we had to get the dreaded cable box so that we could get channels up in all the way up into the 20s, and later the 30s. So all of a sudden, we had USA, we had MTV, we had VH1, we had all of these extra stations, Nickelodeon. Boy, was Nickelodeon different back in those days. But we all of a sudden started seeing all these, so it was more specialty channels, some more, and the landscape filled up a little bit more. And then, and then the time we got to the 90s, the things were really filling in as far as the number of channels and things were available. You had these different comedy channels that came along. Now, I didn't, where I was at, we didn't really get to. We didn't get like Comedy Central or anything like that. A lot of those other things didn't come in until much later on. I was living elsewhere, but the point was that it was constantly evolving. They were adding new things into that, and then then you had satellite. They came into the mix. Interestingly enough, in the 80s, if you had satellite, you had this gigantic satellite dishes take up your whole backyard, and you can only get so many channels on a particular satellite, and if you want to check something else, you'd have to push a little button on your remote, and it would physically move the entire gigantic satellite dish so that it would actually track onto a different satellite. You have to wait for all the channels to come in. Personally, our family never had that. Thank God. Because really, for my own taste as a kid, there wasn't that much more that was gained by having the big satellite dish. That was a great option for people who didn't have very good cable or lived out somewhere where the cable lines didn't run. Or, for the snobs who just had to have, top-notch everything. And then, of course, as you got into the 90s and the dishes got smaller, and then you had the nice little, until eventually you got to your DirecTV style dishes that you just hang up on your wall and you're good to go. And in the meantime, then we get into the 2000s and we've got the digital revolution, and now all of a sudden, you've got channels that are split into other channels, and you've got this immense amount of programming which they use to show 40,000 reality shows and The Simpsons. In any event, so that really has come a long way, and we're in a much more a la carte. You decide what you want to watch kind of thing, because between what you can get on your cable and satellite, you've got your things like your Netflix and your YouTubes, where you can go through and you can actually choose what you want to watch. The kind of thing we would have killed for when we were kids. Let your parents watch their stupid war movies or whatever, and you could watch your Power Rangers, for lack of a better, because I wasn't really much of a Power Rangers fan. I enjoyed it ironically for the first couple of seasons. I was in college at the time, but anyway. So, so you had that just in that regard, And then, and then of course, telephones. Oh my God, the change that we got to see in telephones. Is when I was a kid, a lot of people had touch tone when I was a kid. We were pretty decently far removed from the touch tone revolution. But there were actually a fair number of people that still had rotary phones. And then you got to, by the time you got to the 80s, rotary phones were pretty much gone. The only people who had rotary phones were the ones who had them for novelty. I actually did own a rotary phone. Well, actually, it was kind of a real fancy, old style classic rotary phone that my dad had gotten my mom for her birthday one year, and she used it twice and then put it away, and I ended up with it in college, and I thought that was actually pretty cool. And I had that phone for a number of years. In fact, if I dig well enough, I may even still have that phone, even though I haven't used wall service in almost a decade. So then they got to the touch tones, and touch tone became the dominant way that you handled your phone. And then then by the mid to late 80s, almost everybody had some form of wireless on their phones, which when you're talking wireless is not the same when you talk wireless now. It was still a phone wired into the wall, but you had a receiver, and you could walk. Well, if you had actually a really good one, we tested the one that we had at my house, and I actually managed to get onto the next block, which I would say was probably a good 70, 80 feet before I completely lost the signal. It's pretty impressive, really, given the standards that we were working with. So you had a handset that was hands-free. You had to put it on a charger and keep it charged, but you could dial in the number, and then you could walk away with it, and you could walk all around the house, and that was a big deal. But back then you had a phone. If you were fairly spoiled, or if your parents had a need for one for business or something like that, you might have two lines in your house. But generally speaking, you had the phone. You had one that came in. You might have had extensions in other rooms, but you had the phone. And sometimes I think to myself, how different would so many of the movies and comics and all those things that I enjoyed, how different would some of those plots have been if everybody could get a hold of each other at all times? Half of the tension in most of those movies back then was I can't get a hold of them. Are they home? Did something happen to them? Well, now it's like, one, the odds that you wouldn't get a hold of them are really slim, and two, if you didn't get a hold of them, you get the voicemail, you wait, and then maybe they text you, or if you want to go really sci-fi or they were really important, you go in there and you can triangulate the position based on the signal that's coming from their phone. There's a lot more eyes and a lot more ears, and people are going to be able to be found or reached much easier than they were back in those days. And that was one of the things that we as kids don't really had to deal with, the kids today don't have to deal with quite so much, was that you had to keep in touch, you had to call in all the time, you had to so if you're going to be gone for a little while, you make sure you call and you let them know where you're going to go, because if you didn't, they had no way of knowing where you went. There was none of this, send him a text, where are you? I didn't hear back from you. There was none of that. If you didn't call in, you could only guess where they went, or you had to call around to everybody else to find out where they went. Whereas, now, hell, most of these phones have a tracking chip in them. GPS, you just turn on the locator, and then where your kid went. There's no guess. But again, everybody has their own phone now. There's no longer a concept of the phone for many households now. Everybody has their own. So, jumping ahead, it was, I did jump ahead rather. I got to see this this evolution of the telephones. We went from rotary to touch tone to hands, the wireless handsets, to the bag phones, which you put in the cars, which they'd had those for a number of years. Cell phones actually had been around for a number of years, but they're huge, bulky things only really, really rich people had. And then in the mid '90s, you started seeing it becoming more ubiquitous that people were getting phones in their cars. And those bag cell phones, they had a little thing, and they still had a little cord on them, and then by the late '90s, early 2000s. All of a sudden, cell phones, which at that time, actually pre-flip phone, just a little brick that had a bunch of numbers in a black and white, LCD display on there, and then it became flip phones, and then it became kind of the sideways opening phones with full keyboards, or the ones that opened up and had full keyboards, and eventually went to today's smartphones, which is a computer that lets you make phone calls. Everything's touchscreen, and again, so we've got to see this incredible arc that's gone in with that technology, and everything. There's such a boom in the way that all these technologies go, but my generation was in a unique position to actually see, for the most part, the full arc of how all of this went. Yes, there were older people who saw a little bit further back, and it's not to take anything away from that, because yes, that is very profound as well. But my generation came in at a point where most of what was there when we came in had been around long enough that it was considered the norm. And so we got to see everything come through to replace the last thing and become the norm. Cassettes had come before us, as had 8 tracks, but cassettes became the dominant quote-unquote norm around the time that we were kids. You still had records around. A lot of people used records, but it wasn't, for one thing, you couldn't put a record player in your car, and most people didn't have 8 tracks. So cassettes, for me growing up, cassettes were it. We were aware of the phonograph, which had been the dominant thing for a very long time. We came in just on the cusp of cassettes taking over. And so we got to see, here's our standard of cassettes. 8 tracks quietly disappeared. The records were there, but they were for elitists. And so we got to see cassettes dominate for about 10 years. And then in 85, here comes the CD. And then by the late 80s, boom, everything's CDs. You can still buy the cassettes, but, CDs are where it's at. And by the time you get around the mid-90s, cassettes are pretty much gone. And you get to the late 90s, and the CDs are still here, but here comes the MP3. And now almost everything is MP3, because you can play the MP3 on your computer, on an MP3 player, on your phone. Much more portable, much more, do what you want with it kind of thing. CDs are still being sold, but it's not the same anymore. It's not, you have a format. That's there, or you'll just make your own, spend $1 a track or find other means of getting your music, but but you have a flexibility that wasn't there before, as you're seeing a whole new norm that's come place in a full cycle. This is the type of thing that's been evolving throughout our entire lives. So I may be wrong, but I think Generation X just found ourselves in a unique position where we got to see evolution as a constant and not as something new. The generations before us, yes, they saw evolutions of the things that we saw daily, but it would happen more in 10 block terms, or 20 block or 30 or even 50 block terms. Telephones did not ultimately change for a very long time. Records were the primary thing for a very long time. People got their TV using antennas for a very long time. And in many places, you would see the kind of changes that would happen. And yes, people would get to see those changes, but they waited their entire lives to see those changes. For our generation, there would be, it would seem, a major shift every 5 years. Not a little thing. It was actually a major, either a format change or the way that things were handled. But we see these major changes every 5 years, and and of course lately things have been overlapping more, and it's not an every 5 years kind of thing anymore. But but throughout our lives, from being kids and moving up, there was always we had a norm. The norm would change in some regard somewhere, and it would happen constantly. And because it was there from the beginning, we were able to roll with it. We a lot of times we go, ooh, ah, which is to be expected, but it didn't, we weren't resistant to that kind of change because the change was an everyday part of our lives. And so, now we live in a world where we can communicate our ideas to the entire world, not just in this country, but to other countries, we can share information, we can share ideas. We are more connected, despite the religious arguments, the political arguments. We are more connected as a people than we ever have been before. Our access to information is beyond anything that we could have imagined. I was telling a friend a while back, and it's absolutely true, and it was so weird. When we were growing up, the big thing was we were always looking at, the year 2000 was this far off time, and everything was going to be different. People were going around in backpacks, jetpacks, and we'd be flying around. We'd have flying cars, and we'd be living out in space, and everything would be all space age. You use lasers for everything, and I remember as we were nearing 2000, we're sitting here in 99, and it's been a pretty interesting decade. There are a lot of people who said the 90s suck, but hey, man, for somewhat of an introverted person like myself, when who stays indoors, you had the PlayStation come along, and you're seeing all of these. Movies were on discs now, and you saw some pretty cool stuff that happened all through the 90s. And but I just remember, it was 99. We were coming up on 2000, the millennium, and there was a great debate over, what was the definition of the end of the millennium. A lot of guys were saying, well, when 2000 turns over, and all were saying, no, the millennium doesn't happen until 2001, and there's that debate's kind of retarded anyway, but for all intents and purposes, the new age that everybody was seeing was the year 2000, and I remember in 99 I was kind of bummed because it was a big benchmark throughout my entire youth. The year 2000, that was where everything changes, and when we were coming up in 2000, didn't look that different from 1990. DVDs that were coming down the pike, and a few, some people had cell phones, but it really didn't look that different. And I was like, well, that sucks. Where'd the future go? I was expecting the future. And then one day here, a couple years ago, as I picked up my iPhone to set up a FaceTime call, it dawned on me that somewhere in the last 10 years, the future snuck up on me. And it was just the oddest thing. I was looking forward to 2000, the future, and all these things were going to be so different. And we don't have the jetpacks and the flying cars, but we're in this age where everything's connected. We have phones that are more powerful than the computers that I had when I was in high school, and they run faster, and I can access information on that phone from anywhere I can get a signal, which is more and more places increasingly, especially since you can pick up on Wi-Fi. So even if I'm out someplace where there isn't a cell phone tower, as long as there's a router nearby, I still have access to information. And when I was a kid, I was a horrible student. I really was. And I realized now as an adult, physically, I realize now as an adult that I really do love to learn. I don't like to learn from one source where I'm being preached to. Which when you're in a classroom, that's exactly what happens. They give you a book or maybe a few texts, and they say, okay, we'll study this through this, and that is your truth. That's what you're working from. And even when they did give us independent study, you were still really limited. You had encyclopedias, and you had whatever newspapers you could find, and if you lived in some place, and in my case we did have that. You could go back through old microfiche through the library, but you were limited to what was available in your immediate surroundings, what was in your library, whatever encyclopedias they happen to have, and maybe some local newspapers, and so your definition of what was the truth was very limited. And then, now I don't have that problem. And I really do love to learn, but I have the opportunity to learn how I want to learn. So yes, they'll give me a text. They go, study through this. And then if I have any questions, I can hop on, I can go to Wikipedia, and yes, you all don't have to remind me Wikipedia isn't the most authoritative source, although I've seen studies that actually show that overall it's no less accurate than Encyclopedia Britannica because of peer review, but we'll get into that another time. But I've got my Wikipedia. I could check numerous independent sources from all over the world, much less all over the country, and I can go to YouTube and I can find lecturers, and I can go to Netflix. I can find a documentary. I have all of these resources, all of these ways to study things in my own way, and I can actually get multiple viewpoints. I can see more than just the limited scope that my teacher is telling me. And I mean, that's an amazing thing. And this is just something that really has really sunk in within this last decade or so. There was the internet when I was younger. It didn't really become the internet until I was in my 20s. And then it became more ubiquitous as that went on. By the time you hit close to 2000, just about everybody had some sort of primitive internet access, mostly dial-up back in those days. Then in the early 2000s, broadband became more readily available, and by by around 2004, 2005. Broadband is the standard in many places. I understand. There are places now that don't have access to broadband, but there are ways around that, ways that didn't exist before. You can go through satellite. Hell, you can use your phone as a broadband access point in many instances. You have options. There's flexibility there. There's there's just that connectedness, just this very fundamental way in which the world changed since 2000 just blew me away. It's like, wow, the future got here. It just showed up fashionably late and snuck up on me. And that's I think that's a very profound thing, and that's something that the world has changed in such a fundamental way that the kids of today, I don't think, really see how fundamental that change is. And I see a lot of people, bitching about our freedoms. I see a lot of people that are bitching that, we're constantly being watched. But, and I agree, those are all important things. But the fact that I can have this conversation personally with someone in another country that doesn't have those kind of freedoms, that's a very profound thing. And that's the kind of thing that would have never existed when I was a kid. It's the kind of thing that the kids today. I mean, that's there. It's a part of their world, and very likely will always be a part of their world in some way, shape, or form. And it just fascinates me that it can be like that. Technology changes. It always has. Technology change can be fast. It can be slow. In most cases, it tends to be reasonably slow. I grew up in a time when technology changed very, very quickly. Not so quickly we couldn't keep up, but quick enough for the future to sneak up on us. Pretty big deal. Anyway, I think that's going to be it for today. I think I've already talked everybody's ears off well enough for one session. This is Desert Bob signing off. And if anybody has any suggestions, comments, whatever, feel free to just send it in there. I'll read everything. If anyone's got any ideas for what I might do for a continuing series or show, if there's anything that someone would be interested in hearing me lecture about, talk about, whatever, just let me know. Thanks for your time.